Have a nice group of people here. Let's see, any law enforcement? Okay, no law enforcement here today. Any regulators? Okay, no regulators here. Any bankers here? Okay, damn. If there was a banker here, everybody would be mobbing you looking for an account. Because it's hard for a Bitcoin company or a crypto company to get a bank account. Although it's starting to get a little bit easier as things continue to mature in the marketplace. Oops. Let's try that again. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to just start off with a brief overview of some compliance matters that pertain to cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, and give a little bit of history about where some things have come from, and try to provide a little bit of guidance on where things are going. Do we have programmers here that are working for cryptocurrency projects, exchanges? Okay, a few. Okay. And the other folks here, are y'all investors? Mainly people hodling? Okay, great. Okay. Well, from an investment standpoint, the projects that recognize the importance of compliance and see it as a distinct competitive advantage are going to be those that do very well in the long run, in my opinion. If I go back to 2013 when I went to the Bitcoin conference in San Jose, that was a wild time for a conservative former banker. There was half the audience was computer code jockeys, and half the audience was hardcore anarcho-libertarians. I mean, it was crazy. And you had people jumping around doing freedom rap in Guy Fawkes masks and leather jackets. And I mean, it was something out of this world. Now, things still have a lot of libertarian bent to them, right? And as I get older, I get more and more libertarian. Although I've been accused of being a little bit to the right of Attila the Hun. But I've gotten more libertarian as I get older. But as the system matures, the culture's changing with it because it wants to fit into society and work with society and make society better. And we don't want to have another 9/11. We don't want to have a situation where we've got airplanes, our technology that's used to make life so wonderful and make it better for all of us turned against us and to do something bad. So there's a balance between trying to make sure there's freedom and there's privacy, and that I don't have to worry about people knowing my business. They don't need to know my business. Those are perfectly reasonable human instincts that we have, and we have laws to protect for consumer privacy and to protect us. But we also have to have some reasonable efforts in place to prevent the abuse of our technologies and our systems and our services and our financial institutions from being used by terrorists and criminals who are going to launder money. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So the Bank Secrecy Act started out in a body of laws we call the Bank Secrecy Act. Started off in 1970, and it's gradually morphed and grown over the years. So back in the late 70s and early 80s, we had the cocaine cowboys, and they were going through Miami and South Texas and different places. And it was nothing to see people walking into a bank with suitcases, bags full of cash, and maybe guns under their jacket. They were wearing all kinds, I guess it was polyester and blues and pinks and unusual colors that were back then. But the laws changed to say, you know what, it's not enough to try to stop them with the crimes. The actual act of having that money that are the proceeds of criminal activity is also a crime. So we're going to adjust the laws a little bit to deal with that so we can start confiscating those funds and take the oxygen out of these illegal businesses. Then we had continuing changes leading up to, before 9/11, we had a big rigmarole going on in Congress where people were talking about changing the laws yet again and to better know your customer and do different things. Privacy won out. Know your customer, KYC. That's not a term of law, that's a term of art. And it came from all these bills that went before Congress prior to 9/11. But then we had 9/11. We had thousands of people dead. We had trillions of dollars worth of damage to our economy directly, and then we had trillions more damages indirectly as we went to war to try to stop these people and prevent them from doing similar actions. And so we had the USA Patriot Act, and with that came CIP, the Customer Identity Program, where you have a customer relationship and you have to reasonably identify that somebody is in fact who he or she claims to be. And then you have customer due diligence, where you have to know what type of activity is normal and reasonable and expected for somebody. And then you had enhanced due diligence, where for higher risk customers or things that just don't look right, you ask questions. Ask your customer questions. Where'd you get all that money? What line of business you're in? Did I get this right? It doesn't seem right. So anyway, it's been expanded, and FinCEN is the financial intelligence unit here in the United States. And all the information that's collected by banks and by financial institutions, including money services businesses, including Bitcoin exchanges and ATM operators and others, are collecting information. And if they're complying with the law, they're reporting suspicious activity reports, and they're reporting currency transaction reports. And this information comes together into both a human construct as well as to a computer construct, where the data is looked at to try to identify patterns. Just because something's suspicious, it doesn't mean that something is unlawful. Just because somebody did a transaction that had a lot of cash doesn't mean there's a problem. But if you get a lot of transaction activity telling you things, you might start seeing some patterns. And if those patterns don't make sense on the basis, say, of filed tax returns or other information related to a person or business, then the law enforcement can say, hey, we have a reasonable belief that there's a problem here, and we need to go expend some of our limited resources to go investigate, to take a look at this thing. And those activities protect all of us. They stop terrorist rings, they stop bad guys, they help to correct a lot of ills in society. So money laundering starts with the placement of ill-gotten gains of bad cash, and then we want to layer it, so we create confusion with the ability to follow the audit trail, and then integration, where we integrate it into the financial system. Terrorist financing, similar. And there's been 4 pillars, and there's a 5th one coming. But internal policies, procedures, and controls, the designation of a compliance officer, a training program, and independent testing. And the 5th pillar now is customer due diligence, including the understanding of beneficial ownership. So, there's a lot of money laundering that takes place because people start up shell corporations, or there's a shelf corporation, which is a shell that was started and put up on a shelf for a number of years. And then some people take ownership and operate that fraudulent business as a front to cover up some illicit activity. So with the changes in laws, banks and exchanges are going to have to know their customers better, especially their commercial customers, to know who the ultimate beneficial owners of these companies are. So we've had lots of progress over time. And in 2005, with the USA Patriot Act, all of a sudden, all the light bulbs went off. It was kind of like during halftime at the Super Bowl. People were thinking we needed to go to the Congress and get the law changed, and all of a sudden they thought, wait a minute, existing law says we have to have a program that's reasonably designed. I can't have a program that's reasonably designed if I don't have a risk assessment. So I need to actually enumerate my risks, see what they are, and try to close those gaps through policies, procedures, and controls. And then in 2014, the public was really getting fed up. We had lots of, mainly banks, who were doing bad things. And FinCEN said, you know what, everybody? It's all because of cultural problems. When it gets down to it, you know, these institutions, they suck. They're rotten to the core inside. They've got a problem, and the problem doesn't start at the base. The problem typically starts at the top. It starts with the board of directors, and it starts with the senior management, and it goes through the middle management, and it goes through all the other down to the base, and it just rots. And that rot is causing us problems. So we had situations where, you know, we had fines for Bank Secrecy Act violations that were less than $1 million. And then they became in the ones of millions, and then in the tens of millions, and in the 50s and the hundreds of millions, and then in the billion, and oh my God, that was a stretch, $1 billion fine. And now we've got fines that are, you know, $5, $6, $7, $8 billion. And you got situations, it wasn't a Bank Secrecy Act problem, but with Wells Fargo, I mean, is a problem of leadership and ethics, is a problem of culture, where they were stealing from their customers in order to make some numbers, and people were getting, I mean, people that went to the ethics hotline got fired. Can you imagine? Not only did they get fired, some of those people also got blacklisted, so they couldn't get a job in financial services again. And we're talking about several billions of dollars of fines. And every single time what happens, the Department of Justice ends up working with FinCEN, and it works with the various banking regulators. And what happens is they have a deferred prosecution agreement. Nobody goes to jail. And then they wonder why we're all interested in putting our money somewhere else, that we can have control, that we can make sure that we know what's going on. If I lose it, it's my own damn fault. But at least I'm not going to get cheated or screwed by one of these people. So, you know, there's a lot of angst out there. The number of banks has dropped from like 8,000 banks in the United States down to just barely over 5,000 right now. And there's going to continue to be more consolidation because banks can't make money these days. You have next to no spread between interest rates paid and interest rates earned on deposits. So they desperately need non-interest fee income in order to stay in business. So over the coming years, we're going to see some further consolidation in banking. Oops, I'm sorry, can you hit that one again? So FinCEN basically said, you know, there's things we can do. We can have engaged leadership. You got to make sure that compliance isn't compromised, which means look at the way you're compensating people and rewarding people and make sure those compensation and reward structures are set up in a way that encourages compliance and ethical behavior, and that it discourages the non-ethical behavior. And, you know, it really should go really harsh on the criminal behavior, I think. But anyway, these are some different areas. And then people continue to get mad because there's fines. And the New York DFS basically, I think, got a little bit fed up. That's the Department of Financial Services in New York. It was generally moving towards a new understanding, a new aha moment of the light bulbs going off. But instead of Super Bowl, boom, 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 or the World Cup, it was one at a time and a little bit slow, and people just weren't getting it. And meanwhile, these banks were saying, well, what the heck? You know, it's 1 or 2 days worth of profits for the year that we lose. And the board of directors, you know, they get their bonuses and nobody gets fired, and they don't have clawback of any of the monies given to the executive officers. And they can always get a deferred prosecution agreement. So I think what happened was New York said, we want to have our own law for this next thing that is becoming a best practice and an expectation, but we want to be able to make a prosecutorial decision ourselves under state law if something doesn't go right. Because, you know, New York, think about poor New York. 3,000 people dead, several $1 trillion in economic activity lost just in New York City. And yet they're looking here getting billions of dollars of fines to people. God, can you imagine how much that would hurt? And if that, and your loved ones, and if you grew up and you lived and you worked in what used to be the shadow of the Twin Towers, and these people were treating it as just a cost of doing business. So New York, they said, you know what? We're going to take what's a growing best practice expectation and we're going to turn it into a legal expectation. And what that is to say, in addition to having a risk-based program with risk-based policies, procedures, and controls, you also have to have a risk-based transaction monitoring program. You have to be able to demonstrate that your transaction monitoring that looks for suspicious activity and reports that activity to the government is in fact risk-based. You've got to tie it back to your data. You've got to tie it back to your processing decisions. You've got to tie it back to your testing. And they defined, and I'm going to skip through some of this, but they defined specifically what a financial institution had to do to be able to prove that their system was in fact risk-based. And similarly, with regard to filtering programs, which deals with OFAC, SDN list, and that type of thing, the same thing. How do you make sure that none of these people are on the terrorist watch list? And how can you make sure that you're going to capture that transaction and deal with it effectively if there's a problem? So the real kicker here is that this law, which went into effect January 1st, 2017, that there has to be a written signature and attestation by either the compliance officer or the board of directors of the financial services firm if they're doing business in the state of New York. And if they sign such a document without having obeyed and followed the expectations that are specifically enumerated and laid out, then they're guilty of a crime under the laws of New York. And New York can and will, for egregious violations, I think, start putting people in jail. So what does this mean for the Bitcoin audience? It just means that the market here is growing up. The expectations of regulators are continuing to increase and expand and to grow up. And that people who are good, solid players in the industry who are trying to do right are going to be knowledgeable of these things and make sure that, that their systems are put together in an appropriate way so that they have committed to paper and understanding of their risks. They've developed policies, procedures, and controls to effectively address those risks, that they've looked at all their data and they've made sure that, you know, you don't have to wrangle your data to get it so that you can do manipulation and evaluation for suspicious activity. Make sure that all the different data elements are defined appropriately. You know, you don't want a 264K bucket that has lots of data in it, but you may have several data fields. And that they have looked to make sure that what data is available. How can I use that data to guard against fraud? How can I use it to guard against illicit activity? So, you know, if you're a Bitcoin ATM operator, for example, and you start following this, you might see that you start seeing some patterns of activity. And there's certain $30 to $50 transaction activities that happen on certain days of the week with more frequency than others. And you start looking at your monitoring system, and you start looking at the camera pictures that are taken. And you start seeing there's young women there Some look like they're Americans, some look like maybe they just got off a boat or pulled across the border. And there's a man in the background. And it looks like that man is controlling her behavior. And you start seeing different pictures with different men, sometimes the same men behind different women. So now you think, I've got a typology of potential, could be prostitution, but it's also much more likely that what it is human trafficking. That this is somebody who's holding her hostage and having her put those transactions in to pay for a Backpage ad. That's the type of thing that you can find when you really get granular in your risk assessment and you explore your data and you really start looking to understand your data in accordance with the 504 rules. You're going to start seeing things that were present but you didn't recognize before. And when you recognize those things and you report them to the government the way you're supposed to, it's going to help make a better life for all of us. And in that case, especially for those poor women. I had a client once who, traditional check casher, who identified human trafficking as well once, was able to call the police and save several young girls from the person who was watching outside through the window. So there's bad stuff that happens in this world, and we can maintain privacy, we can have transactions that go quick, we can do things that are wonderful with technology to make our lives better, and we can minimize government intrusion to the extent we can, but we also have to do the job right to try to stop the bad activity. So with that, any questions?
Thank you, Jay. That was very heartfelt.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's open it up for questions. We have about 5 more minutes for a few questions. Who has the first one? Yes, sir, over here.
Part of the problem with, I'm in the security industry, is that the burden just becomes more and more and more. And I've had to take continuing education on this exact subject for the last 2 years. But at some point, it just burdens small businesses to such an extent that it only big companies exist. Right. How do you feel about that going on?
Well, I've worked with quite a few startups, including people with very little capital. So it's possible to do some of these things pretty simply and efficiently. Remember, the law is not that you have a perfect program. It's that you have a risk-based program that's reasonably designed. And there's always room for debate as to whether what you have is risk-based sufficiently or not. But typically you can start off with something small and reasonable, and then just make sure that just like your code, there's iterative improvements over time so that you start small with one thing, and as the business grows and morphs into something much bigger and different, that you've recognized risks and you've changed your program over time. So I would just say it's really not that hard to do it small. I mean, if you're trying to be, if you're trying to go from having nothing and you're already big, then the problem is not that it's so onerous. The problem is you didn't start when you should have.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I came across several coin firms, in fact, which had ICOs. They had their registered offices in Cayman Islands, Madagascar, not in U.S. territory, in fact. So why would they be doing that, in fact? What are the reasons that they're not registered entities here, but they are in some far-off places?
Yeah, there's a lot of legal and compliance issues pertaining to ICOs that haven't been really fully thought through or figured out yet. And I'm an expert on Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering, and I don't profess to be an expert on securities laws that may impact, the Howey test and other things that may impact a ICO. So I'll have to pass on that.
I ran across a news article this summer that kind of bothered me, and I don't know that it was real, but it was from a reputable news source. And it spoke of an elderly gentleman who was going into retirement and had adopted a very libertarian mentality and decided that he just didn't trust banks. And it wasn't even about cryptocurrencies. He was withdrawing his money in fairly small increments and literally putting it in his mattress. And a clerk at the bank reported him, and they decided that he was consciously avoiding the reporting requirements and therefore guilty of violating the law and was tried and given jail time. Does that kind of thing really happen?
Well, probably not jail time for that. The money sounds like it was not illegal source. What does happen is sometimes there's some overzealous police organizations that the act of structuring, doing a cash transaction in a manner to purposely evade a BSA reporting requirement is in itself a crime. So there have been times where various jurisdictions have said, well, we can get new bulletproof vest, or we can buy this, that, or the other. You know, let's go ahead and confiscate that money. And it wasn't anything illegal source. So there have been some problems with that. The Justice Department and others have been working on it to try to change the tone so that if there's not illegal activity, there's less likelihood to confiscate the money.
Isn't that often referred to as civil asset forfeiture?
Yeah, civil asset forfeiture.
Last I heard it had surpassed all burglary in the U.S. as sources of theft.
Well, it's you got to think of it. You know, there's, you know, personally, I'd like to, you know, I said I'm getting more and more libertarian, so I'd like to see marijuana legalized in all 50 states at the federal level, then tax the hell out of it, and build a big, beautiful wall. Because right now you got $25 to $28 billion a year that's being sent across the border to the drug cartels in Mexico. So you want Mexico to pay for the wall? Have the drug cartels pay for it. By taking the money away from them, taxing U.S. citizens who want to smoke weed, and you're done. You've solved a couple problems. But,
Amen.
so.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay.